Hello and welcome to episode 39, Remastered. Today, I'm going to expand the scope of my ecological examination and move from behavioral ecology, which I talked about in the last episode, to population ecology, which will be the subject of today's episode. Where behavioral ecology examines the actions, the patterns, and the responses of an individual organism, population ecology examines the actions and responses of whole groups of organisms. It's the study of the group as a whole. These groups are called populations, and they're composed of a number of individuals of the same species, all living and eating and migrating and reproducing together. Just like an individual organism has patterns in its behavior, so too do populations. If the actions of an individual causes some kind of effect, then a group of individuals, all making the same actions, will cause a meta-effect, or it'll cause that effect on a larger scale. Some quick examples off of the top of my head include swarms of locusts, or herds of wild horses, or some other kind of wild grazing species that will occasionally move through an area in such numbers they'll eat so much of the local foliage that they'll destabilize or outright destroy the native ecosystems. Another example that I touched on in the previous episode is that predator and prey population sizes have a cyclical relationship based on the carrying capacity of the prey as a food source. I'll go into all of this and more in greater detail. Alright, so if you were to try and understand a population, how would you start? What would you look at? A basic place to start is the range of the population, or the geographic regions where the organisms are naturally found. Some animals have very large ranges, like brown bears and black bears, which live in Canada, Alaska, and the Rocky Mountains, as well as most of Asia. Or monarch butterflies, which have a range that spans the entire North American continent. Or various kinds of migratory birds who fly between habitats that are separated by sometimes thousands and thousands of miles. All organisms have a range that extends out to some fuzzy boundary across the geographic landscape, because there isn't a single organism that's naturally adapted to every type of climate and biome. Consider us humans. With our modern technology, like mobile shelters, climate-appropriate clothing, and sealed food, we can live in almost any habitat. But when you strip from a human being their technology, and you put this human naked into a wild environment to fend for themselves, we would find that our natural range is quite limited. No humans would be able to survive in a snowy and icy winter, so no humans would be able to live in much of North America, Europe, and Asia. A naked human living in the wild, basically like our ancestors did more than 50,000 years ago, would only be able to survive in the dry, warm climates of the African savanna, of the warmer parts of the Mediterranean, or the jungles and the savannas of India, Southeast Asia, or Australia. But outside of these areas, the climate is either seasonally or entirely unforgiving to the human body. The temperature and the seasonal changes are just too brutal for humans to withstand without clothing and sophisticated shelter. These factors are abiotic aspects of the world, and they influence the range of the species. Just like the cold of winter limits the natural range of humans, the heat of deserts and the tropics repels those species that are more acclimated to polar regions, like polar bears. Polar bears have a range that is limited by more than just temperature and climate. The polar bears use ice sheets and floating ice chunks as a kind of fishing platform, and they'll ride these chunks of ice and float out a bit into the Arctic Ocean to catch seals and eat them for their fatty tissue. But without their primary natural food source, a polar bear cannot live for very long, and so the polar bear's range is tightly correlated with the range of the ringed and bearded seals. But you also have that influence of the available sea ice, which the polar bears need to use to hunt. The confluence of all of these factors creates the living conditions for the polar bear that it has to adapt to and live in. The seals swim in the Arctic Ocean, coming up to breathe or sometimes to wash up on the ice and take a break from swimming. On land, or I suppose on ice, the seals are a lot less agile. They're really clumsy. And a polar bear, if it's quick and can move close enough without being detected, can catch and kill one. The fact that the polar bear's range is limited by the availability of these seals is an example of a biotic factor. Both abiotic and biotic factors influence the range of all populations, from animals to plants to fungus. Reptiles need the heat of the sun or of the tropics. Amphibians need the humidity of the jungle or a swamp, and the polar bears need their Arctic ice. All of these things are abiotic factors. The biotic factors are the living things or the products of living things that influence or limit the range or somehow affect other organisms. Just like how the seals are a biotic factor for polar bears. But the nature of this relationship, of this food dependence, goes way beyond the Arctic. Bees are dependent on the flowers that they feed from, as are moose by the willows that they eat, and predators like wolves from the prey species that they eat. I didn't even have to move that far out of the Arctic to come up with those examples. All of these animals live in boreal forest or tundra or taiga biomes. Disease is another factor that influences range, like the avian flu in Hawaiian mosquitoes, which drive much of the native birds up higher into the mountains, outside of the range of the mosquitoes so that they can avoid the avian flu. There's also the tsetse fly in sub-Saharan Africa, which has been such a deadly disease vector that it's pushed back a lot of the range overlap that the tsetse fly has with many large grazing mammals. When a species is within its range, it's typically not distributed equally across geographic space. As is the case for many plants and some animals, they might be randomly distributed across the land. This means that the position of one individual doesn't really affect the population of another individual. For example, a shrub-like plant can release spores or seeds that make another plant, either 10 miles away or 10 inches away from the parent. Sometimes the distribution of organisms is influenced by the environment or by the animal's social behavior. If you're an animal in the desert, chances are that you and your populations are going to dwell around a watering hole or an oasis or something like that. In other cases, the animals exist in groups or clumps, like a herd of grazing cattle, or a school of fish, or a family of prairie dogs. These populations aren't randomly scattered across the environment. They're clustered and grouped together because of the particular social behavior of the animal. If an organism is competitive or aggressive towards members of its own species, then the population really can't be distributed in clumps, like it would be in a social species. In solitary species, the distribution of individuals across the landscape is more or less uniform. And when I say that the distribution is uniform, I mean that there's roughly the same density of individuals across geographic space. This is because the individuals either compete for food, or water, or they compete for territory, or some kind of limiting resource. Instead of cooperating and living in clumps like a social species, the populations of more solitary organisms tend to be uniformly spread out across a mosaic of hunting and mating territories, each one belonging to one individual, and perhaps their not yet mature offspring. Now I want to zoom in a little bit and look at the individuals within the population and the various variables and qualities that we can ascribe to them. This would include the number of individuals in the population, how fast they die, how often they leave or join another group, and how fast they reproduce. All of these factors are the population's demography. The size of a population can grow when individuals immigrate into it, or when there's a new birth. And in just the opposite way, the population can shrink if individuals start emigrating away, or if individuals die. To study these kinds of things in various organisms and in various populations, biologists use a probability summary called a life table and an analytical tool called a life history. The life table looks at an organism's behaviors and patterns over its lifespan. How old does it get before it dies of old age? What's the probability that the organism will survive and/or reproduce in any given year of its life? The life table breaks down this data into a series of columns, based on age, number of survivors and their proportion in the population, their rate of reproduction depending on their age, and the average birth rate over time. So let me break this down a bit so it's nice and simple. In the first column of a life table, we have a list of the typical lifespan in numbers of years. If a hypothetical organism has a maximum age of 10 years, then this column will simply be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The next column lists the number of survivors, which is the proportion of the original population over time. I'm trying to keep this simple, so let's say that we're looking at a population of frogs. If a population of frogs has 1,000 offspring in a given breeding season, then the number of survivors at year 0 is 1,000. There's 1,000 newborn healthy tadpoles, all vying to survive and grow. But life is tough for these little tadpoles, and only 500 of them are able to make it to their first birthday. Now we're at year 1, where the number of survivors is 500. These survivors are a little hardier, a little more experienced, and so 300 of them are able to survive to year 2. 250 frogs survive to year 3, and 200 survive to year 4. Going down the years, we might see that by the time we get to the 10th year, or the maximum lifespan of this particular species, we might see that only 10 frogs out of the original 1,000 have survived to their 10th birthday. You might have noticed that this is a rate of survivorship, which is the third column in the life table. In year 0, we had 1,000 newborn frogs with no deaths. Survivorship for year 0 is thus 100%, or a ratio of 1.00. But by year 1, half of the frogs had died. This means that year 1 has a survivorship of 0.5, or 50%. By year 2, only 300 frogs were still alive, and when compared to the original population at year 0, this represents a survivorship ratio of 0.3, or 30%. This goes on until year 10, where we have just 10 survivors, representing just 1% of the original population. The next column is the rate of reproduction based on age, or to be a little more technical, it's the age-specific fecundity. So let's say that the frogs are too immature to have offspring in year 0 and year 1. They're too young to reproduce on their own. However, by year 2, some of the frogs have become mature enough to have offspring. Some of them aren't, but some of them are. But by year 3, all of the frogs are mature enough to reproduce. The age-specific fecundity column will track the average number of female offspring that are had by an individual female frog in each year on average of life. To continue with this hypothetical frog example, the age-specific fecundity column for year 0 would be 0. For year 1, it's also 0. This is because all the frogs are too immature to reproduce. But by year 2, let's say about a quarter of them are mature enough to reproduce. So the age-specific fecundity column will track the average number of female offspring that are had by this particular quarter of the frog population. And then by year 3, when all of the frogs are mature enough to reproduce, the age-specific fecundity column will go way up because you have a larger number of these reproducing females. If you multiply the survivorship rate by the age-specific fecundity, you derive the fifth column of the life table, which is the average birth rate per year per breeding female. Or to put it more simply, you get the population's reproductive rate. In my example, we have a population of frogs that seem to die off pretty quickly in their young age, but they reproduce more often in their late adolescence and middle age. What the life table would show us is that most frogs are being born to frog mothers of intermediate age, around 3 or 4 years old. When you multiply the survivorship rate with the age-specific fecundity, you get the reproductive rate. And if you add together all of the reproductive rates for each year of life, because remember, reproductive rates aren't constant through life, you reproduce more often in middle age than you do as a child or as an elder, if you add all of these rates together, you'll get a number that's called a net reproductive rate. If this number is 1.00 on the dot, the population is stable. It isn't growing, but it isn't shrinking either. The rate of births is keeping up with the rate of deaths, and the population is stable. If the sum is less than 1.00, this means that the population is shrinking. The rate of births can't keep up with the rate of death, and so as individuals die, the population begins to dwindle. If the sum is more than 1.00, it means the opposite, that the population is growing. The birth rate is exceeding the death rate, and the population is expanding. So by using these life tables, and by analyzing populations through this lens of the life table, biologists can keep an eye on the fluctuations in growth and death rates of various populations, and can get a glimpse into how stable they are and how healthy the population is. This kind of data can also be used to derive survivorship curves. These survivorship curves are lines on a graph that show how age is distributed across a population, where the age of the organism is on the x-axis, and the number of surviving individuals is on the y-axis. All survivorship curves start at the top left corner, where the number of survivors at age 0 is 100%, and they all end at the bottom right, where the number of survivors at maximum age is 0%. The really interesting part about this is how the curves are shaped in between these 2 points. A type 2 curve is the simplest curve. A type 2 curve is more or less a straight line between the top left and bottom right of the graph, which represents a species that faces roughly the same rate of death in every year of its life. It's just as likely to die at year 1 as it is to die at year 4 or year 8 or whatever. All of my textbooks repeatedly cite songbirds as an example of a species with a type 2 survivorship curve. Songbirds are just as likely to die at age 1 as they are to die at age 5 or age 10 or however long they typically live. Other species have a type 1 or a type 3 curve, and these are a little more interesting. The type 1 curve shows a high rate of survivorship in early life, representing a majority of individuals surviving through infancy and childhood and making it into adulthood. But survivorship in the type 1 curve suddenly drops off as the individual reaches the end of its lifespan. A type 3 curve is the exact opposite. The survivorship of the young is really low, so the curve will drop down really fast, but it will level out near the bottom, which represents a relatively long life for those particular individuals who happen to survive past childhood. To put the type 1 and type 3 curves into context, consider humans and frogs, like the frogs I used in my earlier example. Humans are a species with a type 1 curve. We put a great deal of care into our offspring, and we try to maximize the survival of our children into their adulthood. In the modern age, with vaccines and modern medicine and seat belts and all of the amenities of modern life, we have a pretty high survivorship in childhood, and in most of adulthood. But past a certain age, like 65 or 70 or 75, or in some populations even 80 or 85, the rate of human survivorship begins to rapidly drop off. Of course, there are some exceptions. I mean, you do have these populations where people live to be 80 or 90, or in extremely rare cases, you'll have individuals who live to be 120, but we're talking about general trends here, and somebody who's 120 is an extreme anomaly. The human type 1 survivorship curve shows the average. It shows a high survivorship in youth, but a low survivorship at the extreme end of the age range. Other examples of species that have a type 1 survivorship curve include elephants and gorillas and other social species that have multiple individuals besides the parents to help take care of the offspring. Now these frogs, on the other hand, have a type 3 survivorship curve. This means that most frogs tend to die young, as tadpoles actually. But those that survive this infant tadpole stage to go through metamorphosis and become a mature adult frog, these tend to live a lot longer. This is because once they're an adult, they can live an amphibious lifestyle. They can move in the water and on land. They have options available. They can move around. They can do stuff. Their ability to survive, to find food and evade predators, and to stay away from toxins and poisons and other environmental contaminants, all of these things are improved when they're a mature adult. Another example of a type 3 survivorship curve is many plant species. Consider a particular species of plant, like a tree, that reproduces with seeds. The tree will produce a huge amount of seeds, and these seeds have a similarly huge death rate. Most of them rot or get destroyed by animals chewing them or stomping on them, and many of those that survive to somehow germinate find that they're germinating in an inhospitable place, and they can't really get a foothold until they die young. Only a very tiny fraction of the seeds will actually germinate successfully and establish a healthy root system in a viable habitat. Of all of these surviving seedlings, which are a tiny fraction of the original number of seeds produced, a huge portion of these are going to be killed by herbivores, or by harsh weather like the cold, or by mechanical damage from some trampling animal, or a geological event like a landslide or a flood. It's only a very, very small sliver of the original seed population that will grow into another mature adult tree. But these trees are strong and sturdy, and they're very long-lived, and they're very difficult for nature to kill. Once the tree has established itself and developed a thick trunk of hard woody tissue, it can live for centuries. This is a great example of a type 3 survivorship curve, where the young organisms have an exceedingly high death rate, but the mature organisms are much sturdier and less likely to die in any given year. So earlier I mentioned life tables, which I just went over, but I also mentioned something called a life history. The life history is a reflection of the life table, but it takes into account a few more variables, like differences between populations in different regions, like a faster or slower birth rate, or a greater or lower fecundity, or a difference in the rate of deaths at certain years. All of these rates are influenced by things like the local climate of the habitat, or the available nutrients and food sources, and the kinds of predators and assorted threats that the population is exposed to. All of these things are context-sensitive to particular populations in their particular habitats, in their particular corner of the world. In my hypothetical frog population, no frogs reproduced at age 0 or age 1, but it's quite possible that some populations of frogs might exclusively reproduce at age 1 in response to a shorter lifespan that's caused by endemic disease or heavy predation. In a particular habitat that has low predation and abundant food, the situation might be reversed, where the frogs might be long-lived and with a low fecundity, where they only begin to reproduce at age 4 or 5. These variations in the average across the species, and the average in these populations across the species, are all local responses and adaptations to the various pressures and threats that they experience. Individuals in certain habitats need to find some way to balance their resource use to keep them alive while also raising healthy offspring. The organisms need to engage in fitness trade-offs, which is a defining aspect of their life history. The life history, most fundamentally, is how an organism prioritizes its resource use to successfully live and reproduce in its particular habitat. For example, does it invest a lot of resources into developing a strong immune system? In the tropics, where diseases are prevalent, this really wouldn't be a bad idea. The population could experience massive fitness benefits if it has a strong immune system in a habitat with a lot of local diseases. This adaptation would help it survive. But in the polar regions, where there's little to no native diseases, investing all these resources in your immune system would be kind of a waste. Because why build up your immune system to be so powerful if you don't need all of that power? It would be better to reinvest those resources into other functions that have a more immediate practicality. Another example, does the organism invest a lot of time and energy into their offspring? Well, that would depend on the mating strategy. Species like elephants and gorillas and humans don't reproduce that often, so these species have the capacity to invest a lot of time and energy into protecting and raising and feeding and nourishing their offspring. But species like insects and fish and amphibians have dozens, if not hundreds, of offspring at once. They can't possibly invest time and energy into each individual, so instead, they prioritize sheer quantity over quality. If an organism lives in an area with a large number of threats, like a lot of predators, and so mortality is very high, then the population would be encouraged to reproduce sooner, and to reproduce more frequently, to ensure that generations of individuals can pass on their genes before they too die of predation, or disease, or whatever threat happens to be there. In the opposite scenario, an organism that lives in a safe environment with plenty of resources and few predators, they'll adapt to take their time and be a little more patient. They might mature slower, they'll reproduce later in life, and they'll only produce a few offspring at a time that will get a lot of love and attention for a long period of time. These are all fitness trade-offs, and they define the life history of not just any particular species, but of particular populations within that species. Life history, or life strategy, is all about maximizing fitness in the particular environment that the organism finds itself in. These life history patterns of the individual are mirrored in the entire population, which naturally will share the same habitat and the same exposure to food, same exposure to predators and to disease. When you look at life histories across species, you start to see a kind of spectrum, with high fecundity or a high reproductive rate, but low survivorship on one end of the spectrum, and low fecundity but a high survivorship on the other end of the spectrum. Those organisms with high reproductive rates and low survivorship tend to have shorter lives, characterized by faster growth and faster maturation, earlier reproduction, and larger numbers of offspring per birth. In contrast, species with low reproductive rates and high survivorship are generally longer lived, with a slower rate of maturation, and who produce a smaller number of offspring across their life. These strategies all contribute to the population's growth rate. Recall the variables that I mentioned earlier in the episode that influence the growth rate. Births and deaths, obviously, but also immigration and emigration, as individuals will leave an original population to go and join a new one. Growth rate is a pretty technical aspect of population ecology, involving a sizable amount of math. I really considered getting into the technicalities and the mathematical weeds of population growth, but ultimately I came to the conclusion that it wouldn't be very exciting in an audio podcast. So with that said, I'll try and explain growth rates without really diving into the math and technical theorems behind it. Just know that this aspect of studying biology is pretty heavily dependent on mathematical models and calculations. Alright, so every population has a death rate and a birth rate, because they all die and they all give birth. And the ratio between these two rates is called R. If the birth rate exceeds the death rate, so if there's more births than deaths, and the population is growing, then R is a positive number. But if the death rate exceeds the birth rate, and the population is shrinking, then R is a negative number. In some cases, a population may experience the highest possible birth rate and the lowest possible death rate, which implies that they've found more or less an optimal living situation. In this case, where the population in question has found an optimal living situation, the R value is called R sub max, or R max, which means that the population is enjoying the maximal growth rate. If a population is growing and its R value is positive, it can be undergoing either exponential or logistic growth. If the R value stays the same, this is to say, if the ratio between the death rate and the birth rate stays the same as the population continues to grow, then the population is experiencing exponential growth. To visualize this, Imagine that you have a population of 100 individuals, and there's an R value of 0.05 per year. This means that in 1 year, the population will grow 5%, from 100 to 105. And the next year, it'll grow to 110, and then 116 the year after that, and then 122 after that, and so on and so forth, increasing by 5% every year. If you have a starting population of 1 million with the same R value of 0.05, then in 1 year, the population will grow from 1 million to 1,050,000. The year after that, it'll be 1,102,500, and then 1,157,625, and on and on. The critical detail to take away from this is that the growth rate doesn't change from year to year. The R value for these hypothetical populations is always 5% or 0.05, and this doesn't change even though the population is getting exponentially larger year after year. The growth rate remains the same. It's really important to understand that exponential growth is seen really only in populations that are small or new to a certain habitat, because exponential growth cannot be sustained forever. You can't have a population that just grows and grows exponentially forever, because there has to come a point where the number of individuals will exceed what the habitat can biochemically support. There simply isn't enough nutrients, or water, or shelter, or whatever other vital resource is necessary to support a larger population. This upper limit on the number of individuals that can be sustained in the habitat is called the carrying capacity. When a population reaches carrying capacity, the death rate will increase substantially and begin to surpass the birth rate. The R value will become negative, and the population will begin to shrink. In this way, logistic growth is quite different from exponential growth, because logistic growth does depend on the number of individuals who are present in the population. If there's a small number of individuals, the population is nowhere near carrying capacity, and so the growth rate is probably pretty high. But as the population grows, the resources in the habitat start getting used up faster. There's more competition for food, there's more competition for shelter, there's more competition for mates. This larger population can also support a larger predator population, and so predation will become more and more common. All of these factors will cause the growth rate to slow, until ultimately it falls to zero when the population reaches carrying capacity. If you were to graph this population growth with time on the x-axis and a population size on the y-axis, the curve would look like a stretched out S, with its upper and lower slopes running along horizontal asymptotes. At the low end of the y-axis, population growth is slow, but it increases rapidly over time as the individuals spread out to fill a habitat and exploit its resources. At about the midpoint of the y-axis, the population size has increased such that there's now noticeable competition between individuals. It's clear to everyone in the population that resources are becoming a little more difficult to come by. It isn't as easy to feed yourself as it once was, because there's more and more competition, and all the food is being eaten up and it's harder to find stuff. The growth rate starts to slow, and the growth curve flips. Instead of continually increasing at a faster and faster rate, the rate of increase begins to slow down. When the population size reaches carrying capacity, or the upper horizontal asymptote on the graph, the growth rate levels out again by nearing zero. The population will fluctuate up here in relative stability, unless some massive death event like a disease or a swollen predator population comes in and cleans house and more or less resets the population back to a much smaller size. The growth rate of a population is tightly limited by these density-dependent and density-independent factors. You can think of these density-dependent factors as things that limit population growth when there's a lot of individuals. Consider the example of trees in a forest. If there are too many trees, they start to crowd each other out. The canopy might block out sunlight and kill the younger, smaller trees. Or they might struggle to get enough water, what with all the other trees nearby soaking up as much water as they can. All the trees are competing for light and water and all of the other limiting resources. Or, as another example, when rats live in high-density populations, they begin to experience something called a behavioral sink, where normal rat social cohesion breaks down. There was a really fascinating experiment conducted by a scientist named John B. Calhoun, who created what he called a rat utopia. It had abundant space, ample food, and no predators. The mice who first inhabited the utopia were quite happy, as they could live leisurely lives full of eating and mating all day without the fear of getting swooped up by a raptor or captured by a fox or a cat. Naturally, with no brakes on their population growth, the number of rats exploded rapidly, and they soon filled their utopia. What happened next was both horrific and endlessly fascinating. The rat population experiences a host of serious problems that basically destroyed their little rat society. With too many individuals crowding all of the available space, the rats were unable to find privacy, and they were thus unable to form strong social bonds with other individuals. They were never able to have one-on-one time with each other, because they were always exposed to a large number of other rats that were always around them. Their birth rates began to plummet, and of those female rats who did give birth, they were terrible mothers, who neglected or killed their offspring, or the offspring of other mothers. Infant mortality rate in this utopia reached as high as 96%. Some of the males engaged in rape, or cannibalism, or excessive conflict, while other males totally shut down and hid themselves away, only coming out to eat and run around when the others were asleep. Malnutrition, starvation, and violence became endemic. Such is the harsh reality of nature when a habitat, even a so-called utopia, exceeds its carrying capacity. Other density-dependent factors include diseases, which, as you know, spread faster in a denser population, as well as the risk of predation, or parasites, or intraspecies competition, and other biotic stuff like that. Density-independent factors, on the other hand, are generally not related to the biotic factors that the population is exposed to. Density-independent factors tend to be abiotic, like an earthquake, or a flood, or a volcano, or a harsh winter, or the pH of the ocean water, or anything like that. In this way, density-independent factors can affect large and small populations, dense and spread-out populations, and it can have any kind of effect on them. A harsh winter might kill a few voles in one population, but another population of voles might be totally wiped out by that same winter. It really depends on a hugely complex confluence of variables, both biotic and abiotic. The last thing that I want to cover today is population cycling, or more specifically, the cyclical nature of population sizes between prey and predator, or of host and parasite. In all of these cases, the populations experience cycles. Consider the predator-prey relationship between a small herbivore like a rabbit and the predators that feed on them, like a wolf or a fox. The rabbits eat shrubs and grasses, and as they do so, their population grows. The rabbit population will grow until they start to run out of food, until there's so many rabbits eating so much grass and shrubs that all of a sudden there's none left for anybody. At this point, the rabbit population will crash as they experience widespread starvation. After the crash, the rabbit population is small, and it needs less grass to sustain itself. This lull in plant eating by the rabbits allows the grasses and shrubs to grow back, and in time the population of rabbits will grow once more to feed on all of the new grasses and shrubs. In this way, the rabbit population cycles between large and small, and the plant population, the grasses and the shrubs, those populations cycle between dense and sparse, based on the herbivores that are eating them. The foxes feed off of the rabbits. When the rabbit population grows, the foxes will have a lot more food available to them. The foxes can eat more, they can sustain more offspring, and in time, the fox population grows larger too. But then the rabbit population crashes, and, for a time, the foxes will struggle to find any rabbits to eat. So the foxes will also experience starvation and mass death, and the fox population crashes. With fewer predators harassing the tiny rabbit population, the rabbits can more easily spread back out and rebuild their numbers. And as this rabbit population grows again, the fox population can also grow back as well. In this way, the population of predator and prey cycles up and down, with the predator cycle on a slight delay behind the prey cycle, which makes sense as the foxes have to actually notice the lack of rabbits and start starving. They don't just immediately starve the moment the rabbits do. This cyclical trend also holds true for parasites and their hosts. In large populations, the parasites can spread to a huge number of individuals and their population will explode. But if the parasites decrease the host's fitness by a non-trivial amount, or they outright kill their host, then in time, the host population will shrink, and the parasites will find themselves struggling to find a home. They'll struggle to find shelter and food, and they too will experience a shrinking population. Okay, that about does it for this episode on population ecology. Population ecology is so fascinating because it's the study of life as life spreads out across the landscape, as population sizes swell and shrink as they respond to the abiotic and biotic factors in their environment. If you liked this episode, then hit that like button. And if you're interested in this stuff and you want to stay tuned next week for my episode on community ecology, where I talk about the interactions between multiple species in a habitat, then hit the subscribe button so that you can see that episode right when it comes out. And as always, thanks for listening.